Greetings, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you so much, Donna, Professor Hill. It is so exciting to be here. It's so exciting to see all of you here. Thank you for coming out to support this historic conference. And I welcome to our illustrious speakers, Nikole Hannah-Jones and Michael Harriot. This is the grand opening night, as you know, of the National Black Writers Conference. And I thought about this conference 2 years ago when I attended the Association of Caribbean Writers and Scholars Conference in St. Lucia. And they emphasize in St. Lucia that we have to think not only about what is going on in our country, in the Caribbean, with respect to literature and scholarship, we have to think about what is going on in the environment. This was 2 years ago. And this is more critical now than ever. So I came away from that conference and I came up with the idea of expanding voices on environmental justice, which in my mind is a code for environmental racism, popular culture, resilience, and peace. We can't talk about environmental justice without looking at its impact on the peoples in our countries, on particularly brown and black people. We have to look at how these issues impact popular culture, technology, and how readers, writers, scholars, and community activists are responding to them. And at this time, which is approaching the founding, in quotes, of our nation, because Michael Harriot and Nikole Hannah-Jones may have some concerns about that term. We face crises in democratic freedom, environmental racism, housing refugees, water shortages, and pollution. Attacks on reproductive rights, a rise in white supremacy, the censorship and banning of our books. And how do we move forward in the middle of these crises? Our writers really very often show us the way. So we're looking forward to having this conversation with Nikole Hannah-Jones, who's documented much of this work in the 1619 Project, and in Michael Harriot's book, The Unwhitewash Story of America. These books provide counter-narratives to the history of America. They provide counter-narratives to the literary texts that we have read. They provide what Toni Morrison would call a black gaze on looking at literature and history in this country. So we're looking forward to having this conversation at what's the 250th anniversary of this country. This is particularly also ironic while we have a president who's just erected, I believe, the Columbus statue, Christopher Columbus statue, on the grounds of the White House, erecting monuments to Confederate soldiers. And the history that is currently taught in our schools is going to be forever etched as history that has omitted the important stories of how black people and brown people and indigenous people helped to build this nation. So I'm going to begin, and we're going to begin with the question. This is for both Nikole Hannah-Jones and Michael Harriot, about your origin stories. We all have origin stories, and I really was moved by the way in your origin story, Michael, you combined not only history, but popular culture, and it was very witty. Sometimes I was laughing, and then sometimes I was really, really very angry, and sometimes I had to put the book down, and if you look at the book, it is marked up, because I said I have to come back to this. And Nikole Hannah-Jones, of course, you started with the 1619 Project with the New York Times, but again, when I started looking at how you brought together contemporary writers and poets and scholars who really elaborated on the problems with that story, I was just really, really moved. And it's a way of connecting what we're reading now, connecting what writers are writing now to what happened in the history of this country. So I'd like you both to talk about what is the origin of your story. Let's begin with you, Nikole.
Oh, I was going to let Michael start because he's our guest in Brooklyn, but I'll start. How's everybody? Everybody's good? Good to see you all. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you so much for creating this festival and inviting us to be a part of it. I mean, I'm very fascinated with origin stories. Always have been. Every family has an origin story. Every culture has an origin story. Nations have origin stories. And if you think about what is the purpose of origin story, it's to create some boundaries to our life, to give some sense of purpose. So we all choose what we want to talk about when we talk about our origins. The nation certainly does, and I certainly do too, right? Like what do I want you to understand about my origin that will help you understand how I want to be perceived and what I see as my purpose? So the way I always think about my own origin story is that my origin story begins with my grandmother, Arlena Tillman, deciding that her children were not going to pick cotton in the South, and getting on a train, the Illinois Central Rail Line, in Greenwood, Mississippi, with 3 small children. She left her husband, and all she had with her was a suitcase and a bag of fried chicken that her mom sent with her because fried chicken didn't spoil on the journey. And there wasn't anywhere where black folks could stop and eat, and my grandmama didn't have any money to stop and eat anyway. And thinking about how that one decision to become a refugee in her own country, to try to have some financial independence, to try to have some political freedom, really made my whole life possible. And so I always kind of mark my ability to become a journalist, my curiosity about history, my curiosity about origins, to that one heroic step that my grandmama Arlena Tillman took. She had a 4th grade education, and yet her making that decision would allow me to create something like the 1619 Project and to become the most educated person in my family on either side. And then there's the origin of like me as a journalist. So I was a painfully nerdy child. I know that's hard to believe because I'm very fabulous now. But it was not sexy back in the day. I was the child who always had a book in my hand no matter where I went. I loved history. I was always asking questions. And I wrote my first, I shared this in one of our group chats when Reverend Jesse Jackson died, that my very first published newspaper article was a letter to the editor that I wrote in 1988 when I was 11 years old, because Jesse Jackson was running for president and he didn't do well in my home state primary. And I felt that part of the reason he didn't do well is because he was black. I thought he was a good candidate. So that tells you how nerdy I was, because I'm 11 years old paying attention to the Iowa primary. And I wrote that, and every day I would go and check to see, did the newspaper publish my letter to the editor? And one day they did. And I never forgot how empowering that felt, even as an 11-year-old child, that I could see something in the world that I didn't think was fair, and I could write, and I could force other people to grapple with those ideas. So I think I always kind of cite my origin as a newspaper writer in reading the newspaper every day with my dad and deciding one day to write my own letter.
Thank you. We know. Thank you so much. Our parents and our backgrounds inevitably influence where we'll go and what we'll do. Michael.
Yeah, I feel like Nikole just told my origin story. I was a nerdy kid too. When I was writing my book, I interviewed my mom because I was wondering, I never asked her why we were homeschooled. And I was homeschooled until I was 12. And she told me she did not think, and this is a quote, a black child's humanity could be fully realized in the presence of whiteness. So my family, I come from people who always, I don't even know if they they really focused on education because it was a default. Like, I never assumed there was an option of like not learning or not going home and reading a book, or when you finish school, not going to college. It was just the default position of my family. You had to learn things. You had to read things. And when I'm still fully discovering and realizing, what my origin story was, just like when I asked my mom. But we always communicate. I always looked at writing as a skill, not an art form or not a talent, something you developed. And we wrote all the time in my house. We had to write book reports, uh, even being homeschooled. And I told the story on This American Life, the podcast This American Life, about my mom used to have this court system in the house. We had this court system. So if we got into trouble, we could actually hold court and argue our case. And we would have to write out our arguments. And my mom would issue written opinions. Like, we wouldn't know, she wouldn't, they interviewed my sisters, and they was like, we wouldn't know when the opinion would come in. It was like the Supreme Court. And so she would tape it to the door, right? Tape these opinions to the door. But my friends who came over my house when I was young, they would come over and they would see, there was always something taped to the door. There was this list of words you had to look up before my mom came home from work. So reading, writing, it was always just part of my upbringing. It was how we communicated. There were no podcasts back then. My grandmother would get mad if we listened to that boom-a-de-boom music. So we wrote notes to each other. And I think just expressing myself in that manner, growing up around real storytellers. I grew up 20 minutes probably from where my paternal grandparents were enslaved. My grandmother and my grandfather, our entire family was enslaved, like within 5 miles of each other in Lee County, South Carolina. My paternal grandparents, my grandmother was born in 1910. Before she lived and owned the land of her family's slave master. And she met her husband there, and they moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and from Yemassee, South Carolina. So I wasn't far from my family's history, right? I was living on it. I would go on the weekends and visit my aunts and uncles who still lived, now owning the land where they were enslaved. So it wasn't like I just hear the stories. It wasn't like learning history. It was just stories my aunts and uncles and grandparents would tell. And I am just now realizing that I was absorbing that, not intentionally, but that's the origin story of that made me who I am.
Tell us about the middle room.
Yeah, so my grandfather built the house before I was born in the 1950s. And my aunt still lives in that house. And it had 4 bedrooms, but in the middle of the house, it was just 1 bedroom, but all of the rooms emptied out into 1 room. And before I was born, he lined it with shelves. And so I have like generations of my family's books are all kept in that room. So like, I remember I read Soul of the Robot, and I was like, man, there's got to be something, right beside it that must be just like Soul of the Robot, and it was the souls of black folk, right? So that middle room was also our classroom, right? And it was also where we held court. So that was part of my origin story. It was the formation of my love for reading and writing.
Thank you so much. So I am sitting in the middle of 2 journalists, and I thought about Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in his last book, The Message, that journalism is not a luxury. He got that from Audre Lorde's statement about poetry, that poetry is not a luxury. Journalists cannot afford to be silent. Journalists must tell the truth. And John Oliver Killens, for the first National Black Writers Conference in 1986, held at Medgar Evers College, had the question for all of the writers: do writers have a social responsibility? Are they just writers or black writers, and what responsibility do they have? I'd like you to think about, reflect on that. What motivated you to become a journalist? And do you have a social responsibility? Or what is your social responsibility as a journalist?
I think I feel the social responsibility, and it's hard for me to connect that to being a journalist because of my family. My family were activists and organizers, so I don't know if that specifically is tied to me being a journalist, but I know that there is a way to tell a story about this country, about what's going on, that necessarily can't be told by other people. You know, one of the themes of this conference is environmental justice, and I remember a few years ago, in like 2015, there was a story in Lowndes County, Alabama, about a hookworm epidemic. Now, before then, the CDC had thought that this hookworm had literally been eliminated from the Americas. And they found that it was in Lowndes County, Alabama. And only 2 people covered it. The Guardian covered it, and then I covered it. Well, the Guardian, you know, they're a British paper, so they talked about this hookworm and the disease and what it does. But because they are not black, they cannot fully adequately explain why this exists in Lowndes County, right? If you don't know what Lowndes County is, it's a black belt of Alabama. People think it's black, it's called the black belt because it's mostly black people, and that's not the origin of that name. It's named that because of the richness of the soil. Now, it was one of the bloodiest counties in the history of America. It's where the Black Panther icon became, right? They went down to Lowndes County, Alabama, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, and the Democratic, mascot was a white rooster for white supremacy. And they said, we got to change that. And Stokely Carmichael and some friends created a new mascot called the Black Panther. But you got to understand all of that lynching history. You got to understand all of that racism, all of that before you can get to the hookworm, right? So you can tell the scientific part of that story, but you don't know what they eventually discovered was that because white people run the infrastructure, they didn't inspect these sewage systems. So these people who would live in these homes who would have septic tanks, when their septic tanks would get full, they would do what they call straight pipe. And that they would just run it out into the back of the yard, and those parasites would get into the ground. Because the ground was so rich, it would become toxic. Same story though, but unless you know the history of the racism of the place, you can't really fully understand the story. And I think that's what my responsibility as a journalist is, right? To create context for America, or otherwise you'd believe, these disparities in testing scores. It's because black people don't value education, right? You think that, disparity in income, it's because black people don't just work that hard. They don't, go to college. They don't want to go to college. And when you add that context, right, it adds information that allows people to understand and get past the mythology of black people. And I think that's my responsibility as a journalist.
Thank you so much. Thank you for tying that environmental racism and justice to the responsibility of the journalist. Your response?
I was so enthralled. I just love being on stage with smart storytellers. So one, I just have to say about the Lowndes County is that they, after all of these years of suffering because of inadequate sewer, and if you know the history of this country, a lot of times the way that they would starve black towns is they wouldn't connect them to sewer or other utilities. So even though they would say they don't want us to be around them. Whenever we would try to go and start our own places to live, our own communities, they would not give us the infrastructure to sustain those communities. So Lowndes is one of those counties. It's one of the poorest counties in the country. And they had actually finally gotten the EPA to take on their case. And the EPA had actually sued Lowndes County in the state of Alabama to force them to put that infrastructure in. And one of the first things the Trump administration did when they came in the second time was they eliminated the environmental justice wing of the EPA, and they closed out that case. And so these folks who are getting ready to finally get not just justice, but safe water, who had fought for decades to get it, were right at the cusp of receiving it. And this is what y'all's president felt
That's right, their
the
president.
government should do, right? Which is also why, I mean, this is why, unfortunately, we've always needed the federal government, because local and state governments discriminate against black folks. They always have. The federal government does too, but that's often our only backstop, but that's another story. I became a journalist for one reason. I believe that if black people wanted an accurate depiction of our experience in society, black people had to be the ones telling those stories, like, period. So I've never been, you'll hear sometimes certain journalists, I will not call them by name, who say, I'm not a black journalist, I'm just a journalist. Well, that's never been me. I'm a black journalist. I want to write about black people. That's explicit. That's why I became a journalist. I don't choose to separate it. My very first, I joined my high school newspaper. My column was called From the African Perspective. And my very first investigation was whether Jesus was black.
So what'd you conclude?
Well, I couldn't prove for sure that he was black, but I could definitely prove that he wasn't white, and that was really the whole point of my investigation. So to me, I work at, the New York Times, so as a lead of a white journalistic institution as you can get. But I tell the stories of black people, and I see myself in the tradition of the black press, in that I've never been a journalist who believes in neutrality. I don't believe in objectivity. I don't pretend when I write about black people that I don't have a point of view. I don't pretend that I think segregation and inequality is okay and I'm just a neutral storyteller. So yes, like I've never been able to nor chosen to separate myself as a black woman whose father was born in Mississippi, as a black woman from one of these small flyover states in the Midwest, as I say, a no-name town in a no-name state, who comes from working class people. My family didn't have formal education, but just like yours, Michael, believed strongly in education. My parents were avid readers. My dad read everything without having to have a college degree. Now, he was reading Louis L'Amour Westerns, but I saw that constant reading. So I feel, to me, you cannot be, I understand the desire to be free of a sense of obligation in your writing, right? I mean, this was what some of the arguments of the Harlem Renaissance were about, right? Can I just write and just create art? Can I depict the stories of black people in a nuanced way that shows all of our complexities, or do I need to do writing for uplift? I don't think that my work is to uplift, but it is to expose. And I don't think that we should ever try to separate who we are as people, the fact that being black is political, whether you want to be political or not, your very identity is politicized. And so what is the point of being a journalist who's black if you don't center your blackness in your journalism?
Thank you. And that is reflected in both of your books. So let's get a little bit into the substance of the book. Michael Harriot, I kept coming back to this sentence in your book because you're looking at the history and what was not told. I learned so much. But this sentence, the Negro is a soldier in the hour of danger and chattel in the time of peace. And you're reflecting on what happened in the Revolutionary War and Civil War. Would you elaborate on that? And what that meant in the history of America.
Yeah, because again, this might be important because we're entering in this phase where we're starting to celebrate the 250th anniversary of this country's founding, or what they call this country's founding. You know, one of the things I thought was important to point out was that in the mythology of America, they always point out, you know, the first person killed in the American Revolution was a black man, and that black people fought in the American Revolution. And I thought it was important to point out that the majority of black people in America, if they were on a side for this Revolutionary War, they were hoping that America lost. They were not on America's side, right? And so why was that? Because the other side said, hey, if we win, y'all could be free. And the point was not about the Revolutionary War. It is a point of a perspective of black people in America. It was just, again, I say this, it was just two groups of white people fighting. You know, we didn't care about the white on white violence. We were concerned with what side most affects our freedom, right? And writing from that perspective helps you understand not just history, right, but America in general. If you understand that, for instance, you can understand why, like, we don't care whether the bombs landed in Iran or Beirut, right? We know this enterprise is a killing machine, right? And the people, for instance, in Palestine are victims of the same kind of colonial mindset that the people that we were when they had muskets, right? They wanted to take something and make it theirs, right? And we're now enabling other people, right? This is neo-colonialism. What we're talking about with Iran, what we're talking about when we send people into Venezuela, what we're talking about when we send people into, you know, when we help a genocide in Israel or ignore a genocide in Israel. What we're talking about is to understand who this country is, right? You have to dismiss the mythology by understanding the people. Again, I never say that you can't, like, the white people are wrong and my perspective is right. But there's one perspective that has been erased. And there's a reason that perspective has been erased. And the reason is to perpetuate that mythology that we live in the greatest land that has ever been landed, right? Like we built this thing through hard work and rugged individualism and a belief in justice and democracy. And we contradict it. Our existence contradicts that. And I think that is an important perspective to learn, not in place of, you know, there was a Revolutionary War, but alongside it, right? You can talk about the patriots and the loyalists. You can talk about, you know, taxation without representation, but you got to talk about the black people who were here too. And I think that is important.
Right, and just to underscore that, the black people so many who elected, as you said, elected to fight with the British, because the British said you could be free.
Right.
If you fought. But in this country, what did George Washington say? You cannot, if you're going to be in this army, you're not going to be free. You have to still be enslaved. There was no rationale to free you.
And that the point of that, though, is not the George Washington was bad and the white people were bad and all that. Like, we were fighting for the same thing y'all were fighting for. That was our fight for independence also, right? Like, y'all desire was no different than our desire. You were just opposing our desire to achieve the thing that you wanted.
Right. Wanted
Let's be
liberation.
clear, though. Let's be clear. The English were the largest slavers and slave traders
right.
in the world at the time. They were not the good guys in the story either. The reason they were promising freedom was as a war measure.
Right.
So the same way in 1863, Abraham Lincoln releases the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, where he promises that the chattel property of the enslavers will be liberated if they're in the Confederate States. That was the same thing
Right.
that Lord Dunmore did with the British. He actually issued the first Emancipation Proclamation. It was called an Emancipation Proclamation to free the enslaved people who fought for his army. If you didn't fight for the army, you weren't getting free. So there were no good guys in the story of slavery, or not that many, and that was just a war measure, just to be clear.
Yeah.
So Michael is correct, though, because this is not, you're not even asking me this question, but I love the Revolutionary War.
Thank you.
You know, the point is, when we learn about that, the history of the war, Black people are largely rendered invisible, except that one symbolic Black person, which is really just helping the mythology of America, right? That we were such a free country that the first person to die was a Black person. We don't talk about that he was a runaway from slavery,
He was a
who
fugitive.
himself was not free, and actually wasn't the first person to die. It actually kind of incidentally died, right? Like he wasn't trying to get shot. He just accidentally happened to be in the area of some
He ain't
ruckus.
have no beef. He was just caught up in some white folks'
Right.
business.
Exactly. And so you have to understand the power, though, of thinking that Black folks actually had agency. That's why that story matters, is that we were not just inanimate objects. You know, the white folks are talking about a war, and we're just in here picking tobacco. Like, we understood that their conflict could be to our benefit. And so we're looking out like, okay, who is going to offer us something? And we will be willing to fight for that something. And I think that's the most critical part of that story, is understanding Black people having agency at the Revolutionary War. Every 1 out of 5 people in the 13 colonies was Black. You don't learn that in school. You learn about one Black person. We don't have a revolution without slavery, because Virginia is the wealthiest colony. Virginia is also a slave colony, right? So you can't even talk about taxation without representation if you don't talk about what they were taxing, if you don't talk about what they were making their money off of. But that's a different lecture. I'll invite y'all later to my Revolutionary War lecture. But I think that mythology of like what we're taught, that this was a war over taxes, it wasn't. You can read the Declaration of Independence, and it will tell you exactly what the war was actually about. They wanted to take indigenous lands, and the King of England was tired of having to send soldiers to fight against the indigenous people because they kept wanting to take more land, and they were mad about that. They were mad about all the slave insurrections. They wanted to not have to worry about abolition that was starting to foment in Britain. And yeah, the northern colonies didn't want to pay taxes, but the southern colonies were actually just fine. They were the landed gentry, and they were living high on the horse. So we don't learn any of that complicated story, and I think what Michael and I are trying to do is just complicate the narrative. Now, it's not even just perspective. Like, there is a factual reality of why we were founded, and we aren't learning that. And the mythology of the country that we've been taught does not explain the country that we live in right now. If you think about what we've been taught, how do you explain Donald Trump with everything that you were taught about this being the most exceptional nation in the world? We're exceptional, right? Not in ways we should be proud.
Well, you just, thank you.
That was my side lecture. Sorry,
no, that's
y'all.
not a side, because that really relates to what I was going to ask you about the highlights of your research and what was really very important to you, but the Revolutionary War. So let's continue on that vein.
So you do want me to give a Revolutionary War lecture?
No. But what were some of the highlights of the research? Because your Revolutionary War is just one aspect. But what are some of the highlights for you? And then I'm going to come back and ask you challenges. But
I'm not going to give it's a long book. I don't want to give the highlights. But I think the basic premise is, this is the 250th anniversary, or what they are acknowledging as a 250th anniversary. And the whole point of the 1619 Project is to say, if you want to understand America, you cannot begin with these ideals of liberty in 1776. You have to go with what predicated those ideas, what allowed them to have the moxie to believe, these white colonists, that they could break off from the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the world at the time. And it was slavery that allows that. It is the wealth from slavery that allows that. And so my argument is that if you want to understand America, you have to mark our founding, not in 1776, but 1619. That it is the trafficking of African people that allow us to even think to become a nation in 1776. And if we don't have that, not only do we not have an America, but think about all of our most vexing issues. They all can be rooted in that decision to begin to traffic in African human beings and create a racialized system of capitalism to justify it. We have to understand that. And so most of us are not taught the year 1619, but we're all taught the year 1776. And what that means is none of us actually can understand the country that we live in. And I just, the more that I read about the period of the Revolutionary War, even I'm a Black Studies major, but my period was really the antebellum period, right? That's usually what most of us spend most of our time studying is the 1800s, what leads up to the Civil War and after. There aren't even a lot of Black early American scholars because they were largely kept out of the field by older white men who didn't want us to bring our perspective into the Revolutionary War, who also believed in that mythology. But I just want you to think about how we're taught that the heart of the American Revolution is the North, right? Philadelphia is where the Declaration is signed, the Boston Tea Party. We think about New York as one of the early capitals. The heart of the revolution was the South. It was Virginia. And how do we know that? Because all of the most famous founders were slave owners in Virginia, right? The man who writes the Declaration of Independence, slave owner from Virginia. First president, slave owner from Virginia. Constitution, slave owner from Virginia. Bill of Rights, slave owner from Virginia. Should I keep going? And yet, we are taught that slavery was somehow incidental to the founding and the nation that they founded. How could it be? When their primary occupation of the majority of the first 10 presidents, 10 of the first 12 presidents, was they bought and sold human beings and forced human beings to labor for them for profit. That was their job. That's how they made their living. We call them planters. They didn't plant shit, okay? They forced other people through violence and torture to plant. So again, it's not judging, it's just a factual reality. And the fact that you can't speak the facts of our history because that scene is trying to destroy our history means we are a nation that is ashamed of our history because our history is shameful. That's all I got to say on that.
I think you have a lot more to say, but I want to hear, thank you. Some of the challenges or not challenges, highlights that you found in doing your research. And you also add these notes. It's really both of you have teaching books. Because both of you have teaching books, where you have the notes at the back and kind of questions people can ask, and you have the poetry, the art. Both of you are really thinking about how we use this in our schools. But what were some of the highlights of the research that you found? What was something that was surprising, unexpected, or?
So there are a number of stories. I think overall, there's this idea among Black people that our history is like erased, or like we don't know where we came from, or, and I think it is important, and one of the things I keep pointing out is, no, they know exactly where to go to get the skilled people that they need, that they needed. They didn't go get, like, we think that they get the strongest, biggest, blackest. Nah, when they wanted some horticulturalists that was suited to build these levees and dams in South Carolina to grow rice, they went to what they call the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is called that because the rice was the gold. And so the thing that we have to reckon with is that our history has not been erased wholly. They just don't teach it. The other thing, I think, one of the most fascinating things that, to me, that are about American history is, I think I've heard from a lot of people that they've heard some individual stories, like this black person did this, but they never connected the dots, right? It is not, we hear fascinating stories and compelling stories, but we don't connect them to the larger scope of history and why things are the way they are today. And I think that that's what why history is important, and that's what it's supposed to do, right? So I tell the story, for instance, one of people's favorite stories is Guy Forrest Joe, who terrorized South Carolina for 3 years, coastal South Carolina and Georgia. But the way they caught him was to create the first formal police department in America, right? And I think those stories and the way that we know that our history is preserved, and the fact that, what Nikole was just talking about earlier, right? So one of the premises of my book is that if you want to talk about black history, then South Carolina is the capital of black America, right? And we don't talk about, there was a whole place that was majority black. South Carolina's been majority black for most of its existence, right? And if you want to know, kind of distill America's treatment of black people and the ideas that built this country down to one place, look at South Carolina, right? Look in the South where the black people were. Like, the American education system as we know it was created after the Civil War by these black people who took over the political apparatus in these southern states because the Confederates were disenfranchised, and we finally had a little bit of power, and we created what we know now as the American education system, right? Access for all to education was not guaranteed to Americans until black people made it so. These things are important because, and here's why it's important. If you know, for instance, that there were enslaved people who were liberating themselves, who were teaching each other, if you know that this entire education system was created by black people, you cannot believe that black people don't value education.
That's right.
Right? You're gonna say, when? We saw you spit on our children when we tried to get access to equal education. We know the history of how this country's education system was created. We know that every state in this union that had slavery, all of the most powerful white men got together and said, you know what we can't let them do? Read. Why do you think they did that? Like, just on a whim? Because we were trying. We were doing it. And that's the thing. That's the narrative that is important, right? That these things are not just cute little stories that show how great we were. It shows what this country is today and why it is this way.
Exactly. It shows the core of institutionalized and systemic racism and how that was used to really prevent people from being educated, the voting rights, all of what we're witnessing now. Now, one of the things that always happens when we're in power, right? You know, what happened right after the Civil War and Reconstruction, Black Reconstruction, W.E.B. Du Bois documented that in his book, Black Reconstruction, right after we had 8 years of President Obama. Under President Obama, we had backlash. I know that you've received backlash from publishing or printing or writing these books. We've seen what people have tried to do, what scholars have tried to do to the 1619 Project. And we're continuing to see backlash. How have you responded to this backlash? And what can we do moving forward?
I'm gonna let her handle that one.
I think I broke my microphone.
Oh.
Hold on, let me try to put it back on. Okay. Hello? No? I really,
There you go.
okay. I responded to the backlash by drinking a lot of bourbon. But I have since been told that that's not self-care, so, you know, it's been 7 years, so I really am at a place of zen. The 1619 Project today exists as the only text that has been named in state and federal law to be banned by name. So we have a bunch of book bans, but the 1619 Project is the only one that is banned by name. There was an entire presidential commission, the 1776 Commission, created against the 1619 Project by Trump in his first term. Two of our favorite senators, Mitch McConnell and Tom Cotton, both who descend from enslavers, introduced the Saving America History Act to make it so that any school district that taught the 1619 Project will be stripped of its federal funds. It wasn't able to pass the legislation, but they created the legislation. And my own home state tried to ban the 1619 Project, which I thought was pretty amazing. And so what I realized, most of that I actually was honored by. Like, I don't want Trump to like my work. If Mitch McConnell was my enemy, I feel like I'm living a righteous life, right? Like, so that didn't bother me. But what did bother me was when you did have a handful of scholars that actually tried to discredit the work. Because Trump cannot discredit any work that I do. But scholars could, right? They tried to credential me. This woman doesn't have a PhD in history. She's just a journalist. She doesn't know what she's talking about. And those were some really dark days. And if you followed me on Twitter back then, you know, if you had 10 followers or 10,000 or 1 million, I always had time. And that is not a healthy way to engage with the public. But a good friend of mine really helped me to put it in perspective. And he said, think about all of the power that has amassed against this project. Think about all of the people who, they know if they pitch an article against the 1619 Project, it will always get published. You have people trying to pass legislation against you. You have the President of the United States who is trying to make it illegal to even be able to teach your work. He was like, sis, you've won. Like, why are you out here fighting with these folks? And that's when I understood. They understand the danger of us critiquing foundational narrative myths about the United States. They understand the danger of Black folks recognizing that we are the true founding fathers of democracy, that we are the greatest democratizing force this nation has ever seen, that even though those white men wrote those words about liberty and didn't believe them, we looked at those words and said, we're gonna fight to make them true, not just for us, but for every marginalized people in this country. Like, there is a power in that. But there's also a power in white Americans having a greater understanding of what their own country is capable of as well, right? Every time when they talk about being so shocked, this is not America, that's the problem. I mean, I'm being sincere here, right? The belief that we're somehow been a force for good and that it's an aberration when we're not is how we get where we are. So we have to understand, like, we are in a narrative war. The people who control the narrative control the politics and the policies. And so to have someone who is able to take the New York Times and have them publish the blackest thing they've ever published in the whole history of that newspaper, I'm convinced, like, had I published the exact same thing in a Black publication, they wouldn't have cared as much. That's right. It could be identical, and they wouldn't have cared as much. So to me, like, how I deal with it now is different than how I did. Now I understand, like, the resiliency of the work and the power of the work and the fact that if they had ignored the work, it would have been inconsequential to the narrative about America that they were using to justify the inequality and the undeserved power that they hold. And that the most powerful thing we can do as Black people is one, to assert our existence, to assert our contributions, to challenge the narrative, as Michael said. Just by us existing, we give lie to the narrative. Because how do you explain us? You're the greatest, freest country, the most democratic country the world has ever seen, and yet you enslaved 1/5 of the people in this land. At the end of slavery in 1865, we had the largest population of enslaved people in the world, in the United States, in the great free United States. So how am I dealing with it now? I am moisturized and living my best life, right? Because the thing is, it's 7 years out. I'm not still getting on the bestseller list like you, Michael. Michael's still getting on the bestseller list. And people still want to talk about this work. This work still exists. It's in thousands of classrooms all across the country. And Trump is still, right, trying to castigate the project. So, amen. I'm moisturized. I'm doing great.
Okay. Love it. Love it. That's the story of resilience, theme of this conference, resilience. And that's how we survive. Michael, you are on the bestsellers list. So how did you resist that?
Well, so I can't pretend like to compare any backlash that I received to what the 1619 Project received. In a sense, you know, she kind of deflected all of the criticism for a whole generation of black writers, because we can exist now because they mad at the 1619 Project. So thank you. But Nikole said something that is important, whether you are, especially for black writers, but if you're a journalist, if you're like a newscaster, if you're not making white people mad, right? Like, not intentionally, right? You have to question, am I doing it right? And that's a real thing, right? And I didn't realize that because I do not write with the feelings of white people on my mind, right? But no matter how sanguine it is, they're going to be mad. And I realize that, like, there is no way to avoid them being mad or to pacify them. So why try? So the thing that I realized, and why the 1619 Project, I think, is important, is because the reason that they're mad is because of what Nikole said earlier about complicating the narrative, right? Because if you read the 1619 Project, it doesn't say, well, that stuff that they said Thomas Jefferson did, he didn't write the Declaration of Independence. It was a black person that was hot. Like, no, that's not what it says, right? And so it's not contradicting their factual stuff. And what they're doing is, what they're attacking, right, is what all historians do. We get a set of facts and we said, what does this mean? Right? What are they talking about? How do I interpret this data, these documents? How do I interpret this through my lens? That's what historians do. They don't like her interpretation. They don't like that she uncovered because if it was non-factual, if my book had a bunch of things that were mistaken, because nobody in here can really point to the thing that they say, you know, the 1619 Project gets this thing wrong. They're like, nah, it just makes people feel bad. It just attacks America. It's unpatriotic. Those are the criticisms, right? And the thing that I have begun to understand is that if it was not good work, they would not be mad.
They would not have paid attention.
Right? If it had no factual basis, if my interpretation was wrong, if only I could reach these conclusions, they would never attack it. They would never report about it. All of the scholars at all of the colleges in America wouldn't be mad about it. The president wouldn't be writing legislation about this one book unless there was something that rang true about it. And that's the thing about in any field you're working in, right? When it is attacked just because it exists, then you probably are doing right. Because you gotta look at who's attacking it. Who's attacking your work? What are their criticisms? I think you have to have a sober examination of your work. Every scholar and every writer should do that, right? We all write with editors, right? It's not like also Nikole sat down and she just wrote a whole book and no editors read it, the people at the New York Times didn't read it, it just ended up on the shelves. The thing that I am proudest of, though, is if you go into any black home that has a bookshelf, you're gonna find the 1619 Project. You're gonna find Black AF history, right? Like, the interesting thing about my book is that they didn't even know what it was or what it was going to be, right? I thank them for publishing it. But like 3 days after my book came out, it was like, hey, we gotta run another print because we ran out of books, right? It came out during the writer's strike, so that I wasn't on any major television shows. I was on Joy Reid's show, that's it. Everything else was black podcasts and black media. And to this day, really, like it doesn't have a real review in the New York Times. And it's still beating all of those books. So the thing that makes me proud is that it's us reading this book, and telling each other.
That's right.
And that's what's important about both of these books.
Right. And that's the way forward. We're going to take some questions. We're going to take some questions. So if you have questions, I don't see a microphone or any. Oh, okay. Here we are. I see the microphone lady. Microphone lady.
Looking fly, too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you both so much.
Can you introduce yourself?
Hi,
Stand up
John.
so we can see you.
John Faulkner from Queens, New York.
Okay.
My favorite topic, and I'd like both of you to sign my book when we get out there, is religion. The two sides to that very sharp sword. So I'd just like to hear your intakes, because you open people's eyes so much to the atrocities that we know that people do, but they don't understand the psychological damage of not knowing your history, not knowing your culture, and believing things that are not true. And you mentioned some of these, distortions. And as I looked up, and some of us have, in 1500, 1492, we were not Christians. Not in West Africa, not on that coast. Everybody wants to talk about Ethiopian Bibles. No. Where were we from? Were we Christians? Were we Islam? And the answer is no.
So I write about this. There's a chapter in my book called The Negro Spiritual. And I write about, black religion. I posit the theory that, and Du Bois talks about this too, that the Christianity practiced by black people is not the same thing as like the Christianity that we know. I call it the black religion. Now I know that there are some intersecting parts, right? But I look at the religious aspect of our history as an institution of liberation and all of that. But the thing that we have to understand about this critique is that it is a critique of human mythology sometimes, and not just like Christianity. Like white people used Christianity just like they use any other form of social manipulation, right? And it ain't Christianity. It ain't like Jesus said some stuff that was going to be detrimental to black people. You're talking about the human manipulation of people through mythology through the years. And if it wasn't You know, I mean, we see the same thing with every religion, honestly, right? In the wrong hands, it will end up as a bunch of bearded men trying to manipulate society and sleep with young women. That's what it always ends up. We're gonna be honest. We go like you asked, right? It's gonna be long bearded men messing with young girls. And I don't know if that is unique to America, white people, or Christianity. It is a human condition like war, like power, like greed, and like any other avarice.
Wow, okay. We have another question.
I don't get to answer?
Oh, were you asking both?
Sure.
Was that for both? Okay.
Go ahead. I want to
Yeah,
hear
we
what...
want, yeah.
It's time to move on. That's
Yes.
okay.
Okay.
I mean, my answer would
Okay,
be- my answer
and
would
so
be
let me
short,
just, before you
or
answer,
not.
because I see a few hands up and just want you to really zero in on what your question is. And if you want to direct it to one person or if you want both people to answer, please let them know. So Nikole, let's have you respond and then we'll have,
Okay.
I think that's Ken.
She's like, we are over time. Just quickly, well, I'm agnostic, so I can't speak from a personal basis on religion, but actually, factually, in the 1400s, there were West Africans who were Christian. So Angola had adopted Christianity. In fact, the first Africans brought to Virginia in 1619 had been baptized Christians and had Christian names. There were also, we have a lot of history of the Africans who were sold into the United States being Muslim as well, right? Because religions often exist to colonize. I mean, that is what almost all religions do. And then, of course, there were also many who practiced indigenous religions and that still, right, practice a hybrid of those indigenous religions. But I don't think, Christianity or whether you were Islamic or Christian or practice animism, that's not really what's at issue here, right? It is, as Michael said, the way religion was used. I said quickly, but originally the idea was, and coming from the Pope, right, that you could only enslave non-Christians. And so African people savvily realized, I need to convert to Christianity, and then you cannot enslave me. But of course, what they didn't understand is with these folks, there was always a trick to it. So once they converted to Christianity, then they changed the rules and made you enslavable by race. So first it was like, if you're Christian, you can't be enslavable. Then they were like, no, if you're African, it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not, you are inherently enslavable. So it's the use of the religion, but not whether or not we, no religion is truly indigenous, right? All religions are created, and then all religions are used to colonize.
Right. And I want to suggest something because I see Leah's going around. Why don't we just have the people who want to question stand here in the aisle? She'll bring the microphone. She'll hand the microphone to you with your question. Ken, why don't you stand up?
We're going to do
everyone
a speed
stand
round, though, right?
Yeah, stand behind her so that those people who have questions.
Okay. Hey.
And introduce yourself, question.
Absolutely. Thank you. My name is Ken Granderson, and I have a question about controlling our narratives. And it has to do with, the question is, are many writers using technology to control our narratives? And I'm speaking as the creator of blackfacts.com that has been putting Black history online since 1997. No white folks ain't touched me. I say what I want to say. We got Aretha Franklin's birthday on video today. And I've been trying to get the attention of folks in academia and writing forever, because these things can talk directly to our people without them having any control over our voices.
Okay.
And so I'm wondering, what are folks doing?
Who question is asked? The question is the impact of media technology on the Black narrative.
I think it... I think all writers and researchers use the technology that they have available to kind of synthesize and tell their stories. I think what the problem is that we're going to discover soon is that with the AI slop that's online, right, like, it's going to be muddy. I commend you to read Contraband Camp, that we wrote a story exactly about that, how this AI slop is spreading narratives that are not true and creating like these historical stories that have no basis in fact.
Right. Just repeat what you want them to read.
Contrabandcamp.com. There's a story. The first story you'll see is on a series of AI-produced stories that have no basis in fact.
Thank you.
I would just quickly argue, I don't think the problem is writers and storytellers not accessing the technology. I think it is the short attention span of Americans. I think every last one of you know that y'all often are not reading long text. You're not even having the patience to watch a long explanatory video. If you're like me, you have 12 tabs open, 50 tabs open. You can't get back to that thing you started. So the problem is we have more information than we ever had before, but a shorter attention span to it. And I'm not sure how we address that. And we have a political party in charge who is very aware that all they have to do is do something crazy day after day after day after day, and we'll stop paying attention to the thing that we need to. That's the problem.
That's right. And the master of that distraction is number 47, right?
Good evening. My name is Tiaya Smart Young. I'm also a writer. My question is specifically for Nikole Hannah-Jones. What kinds of literary salons can we expect when you open your bookstore here in Brooklyn? Because we're coming.
I paid her to do that, y'all.
You did not. But my Cash App is.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I'm opening a bookstore and literary salon in Bed-Stuy called the North Star Books Plus Bar. Follow us on Instagram. Hopefully early summer, depending on my contractor finishing his renovation. The point of the North Star is one is named after Frederick Douglass's newspaper, which was named after, of course, the North Star that got us to freedom, is I want to make sure all of the brilliant Black literary talent, it never comes in our neighborhoods. So if you have a book out, if you are a spoken word poet, if you're just an artist, I want us to be able to come in an elegant, beautiful space in our neighborhood. I've already tapped Michael. He's also a spoken word artist. That's what he's going to do for us. But literally, every writer you can think of that you love, they're going to be in the North Star. You're not going to have to travel to somebody else's neighborhood to have the best, blackest conversations, and a great drink and a beautiful, the decor is going to be beautiful. It's going to honor our ancestors and our traditions. Thank you.
Ashe. Ashe.
Congratulations, that's amazing. There are actually two young ladies that just published 2 books about Black bookstores. You know who they are, right? And that's phenomenal, so congratulations.
First Black bookstore was founded where? Anybody know? It was in New York. It was in New York.
Liberation? Is that Liberation? Oh, National Memorial.
The
It's not
first Black
Sisters?
bookstore
In
was
New
in the
York
18.
City.
It was in the no
Oh, I thought, okay.
1830s. 1830s. y'all.
Well, teach us. Okay, thank you.
In New York.
Manhattan.
Hi, so my name is Dr. Ayo Sakai. I'm an author, so I hope my book will be in your bookstore, and CEO and founder of Universal Right Publications. So my question is going back to you, Nikole, where you talk about the backlash, and I'm thinking more about the scholars. I'm calling it Black scholars because in my mind that's what I'm thinking. The scholars who attacked you and the work that you're doing. Now, what do you think happened when we as a people do not support each other in our literature, in our writing, in our storytelling, and what the impact of that will be historically when we're attacking our own work in light of what's going on in our society?
Thank you for that question. I agree wholeheartedly with Michael that we can't do big, ambitious work and not expect critique. and that any scholar expects critique. And there was legitimate critique of the 1619 project, most of it coming from the left, in that the project was actually perhaps too patriotic, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. So I felt actually most of the scholars, Black scholars, I didn't feel attacked the project, but I did feel that some Black scholars had critique of the project. And I don't think that any of us should expect that we are a monolith any more so than any other people, and that we have to be able to have conversations of open critique, which is different than attack. And frankly, I never felt any real pervasive attack from Black scholars. There's a couple Black scholars I wouldn't invite to my bookstore, but actually, I'm playing. The thing is, I'm an Aries. It's Aries season. Okay. I love vigorous debate. So there was one Black scholar in particular, historian named Leslie Harris. She wrote a piece that was published in Political or The Atlantic? The Atlantic. To this day, it's one of the most widely read pieces because it was a Black woman that they were able to use her critique against the 1619 project and say, see, we're not being racist or credentialist because this Black woman wrote this critique. I've had her come speak to my class at Howard every semester I've taught the 1619 project because I don't have a problem with debate and with good faith criticism, and we have to, as Black folks, be open to that and able to defend. But the handful of people, the handful of Black scholars who I didn't feel engaged in good faith critique, someone like a Glenn Lowry. Okay, look who he is. Look who he is. That's all I'm saying, right? So this is not someone that I would be worried about. The people whose work I respect are the people whose critique I respect, and the people whose work I don't respect, they can say all they want, I'm still winning. Okay.
Thank you.
Hello.
Professor Bennett.
Hi, I'm a faculty member in the CUNY system and a colleague of Dr. Green, who has done such extraordinary work for her entire life, and we're so grateful for her. So I just want to make sure to state that. So my question is related to some things you were saying earlier. I find that I'm old enough to see some crazy politics, but I find the current situation horrific. And I'm wondering, given your historical understanding of resistance, what has your research taught you that we can apply now, and maybe in ways that we may not have considered? And also, and this is related, how do you make sure that Black women do not get erased from the narratives? That's something that we as Black people have to accept responsibility for that. How have you made sure not to do that in your work, and how can centering or including Black women in the solution help us solve the current fascist crisis?
Thank you. We have 2 people in line. We're going to stop at the last person.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So funny you should ask that. That's the actual subject of my next book. The premise is, because when we read these books about fascism and tyranny and fighting it, right, they use the example of Germany under Hitler. They use the example of the 1920s under Mussolini, where the fascism party actually came from. Black people in America are the only group of people in the history of the world who have defeated a fascist regime without a military or widespread bloodshed. So if you want to learn how to do it, just look at what Black people did. We have all of the lessons. And I think that to the second part of your question, right? Like, when we do a real examination of history, we kind of have to, we don't have to like search to include Black women, right? Like, we know that just like Black history was excluded from American history, the Black scholars, the Black male scholars, excluded women to center, like, they don't tell you where the ideas from the civil rights You know, they don't talk about Ella Baker. They don't talk about, you know, most of the women. So we don't have to like pull out these women and search for them. All we have to do is just like America has to be doing, just stop being racist, and we'll have the
And sexist.
and sexist.
Black men erased us
Right.
from the stories of the civil rights era.
Right.
as
That's
well.
that's the scholars of that era. And then if you do a kind of a real deep dive into the civil rights era, it wasn't just the scholars who we told the stories, it was the people who we celebrate. Say, now we can't have a woman doing that. And some of them were the abusers, and that stuff is going to be coming out, and we're going to have to reckon with that too. And so how do we reckon with that? Like, stop being sexist, stop being racist, and do a real accounting of history, which is what we should want anyway.
Thank you. Yes, okay.
Oh, okay. So first, I would say the answer to our not the answer, the roadmap for how we're going to get out of this is not really found in this room, right? Because social movements are led by young people. And we are not bringing enough young people into this conversation. And I think a fundamental problem after the civil rights movement is too many folks held on to power for too long and didn't bring up a next generation. And now we condemn that generation for not knowing how to be activists, or we think they should only be activists in a certain way. I agree with you, sis, that this is the darkest period of our lifetime. Now, there are people in this room who have seen darker periods, but we're born as that first generation following the civil rights movement. We don't know the America. We have not lived in the America that they are preparing for us. And I think that means we're ill-suited for the struggle ahead. I can't tell you how many people who are like, I want to do something, but I'm scared to lose my job. Well, thank God our ancestors didn't think like that. Amen. Right? So I would argue the template is there. We know how to struggle against this fascist society. There's a great book I just finished about 6 months ago called the Black Anti-Fascist Tradition, which actually like breaks down the original anti-fascists were people like Ida B. Wells. We don't talk about her in that language. But I think we are going to have to realize that every last one of us who was like, I'm not my ancestors. You're right.
Yeah.
You are absolutely right. Because you won't stand up to your boss at work. So don't talk about what our ancestors put up with and endured. So every person who thinks they would have marched with King, this is your chance to show. So I think we have the answers, but I don't think we necessarily have the will, right? Because they let a few of us into the systems so that we will now protect the systems. That's the problem. But the answers are young people. And let me just add one thing about women. I don't think women will ever be erased from the story going forward. If we look at who has led and been the face of all of the social movements in modern era, it's been women. And Black women are not going to be pushed back in the shadows of the narratives of history again. I'm not actually worried about that. We are, you know, I always think about the company, Women's Collective, right? And when they gathered and they said, if Black women are free, then all people will be free because Black women sit at the intersection of all oppression. And Lord knows, if folks had voted like Black women did, we wouldn't be living in this America right now.
That's right. You're absolutely correct about the movement being led by young people. And so everyone is charged here to make sure that you identify at least one or more young person to bring back for the next 3 days of the conference. We have a panel discussion by our student leaders, student writers, tomorrow afternoon here at the conference at 3 o'clock, I think? 4:30. I'll get it.
1:30.
1:30. Yeah, come back. Okay, yes.
Okay, good evening.
No, wait, this is the last question.
Okay, I'll make mine.
No,
Okay, so
we're gonna do this 1, 2, 3. Just give your question, and then we'll have them respond to it.
okay, so I live on the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge, across the street, what has evolved from the African Free School. and I wanted to have conversation on the psychological damage of being in an integrated school right now. My beautiful grandchild went to school in Bed-Stuy, and she felt very proud and happy to be in school. She's now in the East Village, and it's a real chore getting her to school. Her ego has been deflated. She's one of maybe 3 or 4 black children in the classroom.
Thank you. Psychological damage of black children in integrated schools.
Well, I think
Wait, we're gonna get all the questions.
Oh, okay.
Besides how H. Rap Brown passed away, freeing political prisoners, I know we're doing writings and so much, but it hurts that and medical apartheid is still going on. You know, many people are going into hospitals and so forth and nursing facilities, and it is understaffed and has been short-staffed from before I became a nurse 30 years ago. You know, so I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Thank you. Psychological impact
And the best
of medical apartheid.
bookstore I ever went to was Nikole Books.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Okay, the next question.
This is our last one.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. I'm a former political prisoner, and I heard you make reference to something about Sister Leslie Harris or something. Is this the same sister to be on WBGO? No. Oh, well, I'm missing something. But in any event, I would appreciate it if you would apprise us where will you be located so I can reach out to you personally and find out what's going on and stay connected with you, because I heard a lot about you, but I haven't personally met you.
Where will I be located?
Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
Of
Oh,
course,
yeah. We'll start with both of them. Where you be located?
The bookstore is going to be at 339 Macon in Bed-Stuy, the old Macon 5 and Dime by Miss Hayes used to own.
Well, sister,
Okay,
sister
we-
asked me to make a statement, and I'm saying this upon behalf of myself and others. Free all political prisoners.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. You're going to answer his question?
Oh, I didn't have. I was going to. I think one of the women asked about the psychological.
Okay,
damage
so
to
we're
children.
both, you can both answer the psychological damage to black children going to integrated schools.
Well, so I think I talked about my mom raising us, but I also I'm just learning recently about people ask me why didn't we learn this in school? And I'm just now realizing that there are people who expect the schools to teach black children about themselves. I thought that was understood between us. That was the stuff you got to know for the test. Yeah. But to know us and our history is a different thing. And I know it's an unfair burden to have our children learn 2 different lessons, right? But I think that to exist in a white space is to undergo that psychological examination. That psychological damage, unless you have been buttressed against it at home and prepared, and you have to, because they're going to, kids make fun of each other, and you're going to run into bullies. I just learned to accept that I was weird, because I knew that. I think the most important thing is if a child knows that there's a space where they have unconditional love and acceptance.
Thank you. Did you want to add to that, Nikole?
Sure. If you know my work before the 1619 Project, most of my work was on school segregation, school inequality. One of the pieces I'm most well known for was a cover story of the New York Times Magazine called "Choosing a School for My Daughter in a Segregated City," when we were trying to talk about navigating being a person who believes in the moral and ethics of public. Oh, she got it right. What? You're a real fan. She got it right there. That's my baby right there. She's not a baby anymore. She's turning 16. And the truth is, we are 13% of the population in the country that enslaved our ancestors. What that means is there will be a struggle, it's just which one. And I think we just have to face up to the reality of that. So the very first school integration lawsuit was in Boston, Massachusetts in the 1830s, and it was a lawsuit brought by a black girl who wanted to go to her neighborhood school. That was also Brown v. Board. Linda Brown wanted to go to her neighborhood school. She was being sent out of her neighborhood to go to a segregated school. But the original fight was to just get equal resources for the black school. So every school desegregation lawsuit began as an effort just to give us our same quality of education, same textbooks, same buildings, same facilities. It was not a desire to put our children into white spaces where we knew people would not think that our children were worthy of a quality education. But every last one of those suits ended up as an integration lawsuit, because in this country, when our children are segregated, they will never receive the same resources. They just won't on scale. And so what you always are having to do, if we had true integration, which is a sharing, right? Not just letting a few of us into a white school, but creating a truly blended, integrated school where there is power sharing, it would be fine. We just never have that. So all of us are having to make trade-offs, right? Do I put my child in a white school where they're going to get the best resources that a community has to offer, but then my child is going to psychologically suffer, which was my experience? Or do I put my child in an all-black school where psychologically they're going to be made whole, they're going to have nurturing educators who believe in them, but they're not going to get the same resources and then have to go compete in a white world where they won't have had the same resources? Unfortunately, on scale, we can all name very, very high quality, high resource black schools, but we've never scaled it, right? So there's always why we can name that one school in that community, but most kids were not getting that experience. So I wish I had like a good answer, but I think Michael is right. My child I enrolled in black schools on purpose, segregated black schools, knowing what that was going to mean for the quality of her education. But I also built an armor around my child before she ever went into any educational setting. My child would tell you she could not watch not one white Disney movie. Literally. She could not watch, Frozen. I don't know how she learned the song because she never watched it in my household. She didn't have white dolls. She didn't have white books. And it's not because there was something wrong with white folks and learning about white people. There's not. But the whole world was going to give her that image. I had to build her an image of herself as a black girl before I sent her out into the world. And we cannot cede that responsibility to any school, because there's a lot of black schools that don't teach our children self-worth and black history either. So we have to take that responsibility on ourselves. And you have to read Black AF history. You need a children's book version.
It's coming.
Okay, good.
Okay. Yeah.
I understand, but this is again the struggle. Like, what is the solution to that? My solution is I take my child out of that school. But we make a trade-off as black parents. Again, we're trying to figure out what is the least struggle. So my parents bused me into white schools too. I scored in the 99th percentile on all my state tests. And yet, my college counselor told me I should go to junior college, to community college. There's nothing wrong with community college, but he wasn't telling the high-achieving white students they should go to community college. But my parents had to make a trade-off, right? My parents had to say, what can I give my working-class child? I can get her that education, but she is going to suffer, but she's going to come out with the same education that those white kids got. There's not a perfect solution for us. That is the problem. There are some high-achieving black schools in the city. The problem is every black child's trying to get in those schools, and there aren't enough seats. So we have to think about, is it possible to completely reconstruct a public system of education that was segregated from us from the beginning, that was never intended, but this isn't just public education, right? I believe in public schools. I'm a public school advocate because I believe in a common good. I believe that's our best hope, is not just to take our own individual advantage for our children, which is why I made the educational choices I made. But we're looking for the world in America where we don't have a struggle, and that world does not and will not ever exist. So what we have to do as a people is figure out, how can I most mitigate the harm? And how can I try to work the system to my advantage? So what I tell, I teach at Howard, but I go speak at PWIs all over the country. And every time I speak at PWIs, I have a line of black students who are talking about, how alienated they feel from their college experience. And what I tell every last one of them, either transfer to Howard or, or be methodical about it. Come and get what you came to get from these folks and move on. Get what you came to get. So if she's young, it's hard to tell her that, but she's gonna go out into a world that's just like that. So if she learns how to compete and hold her own in that environment, they can't stop her when she graduates. So get what you came to get.
All right, thank you. Last question, medical apartheid. No, medical apartheid, someone had a question about medical apartheid. It was a comment. Okay, I want to thank both of you. If you have a closing statement and that you want to make, either one of you, as we close, because I see Professor Donna Hill is ready.
Yeah, I think
She's
I'm going
ready?
to cede to Professor Donna Hill. I think she's ready, so I'm going to cede to her.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Let's give them a big hand. Thank you for this intellectual and down to earth. Yes. It was an intellectual and a down to earth and fun discussion. Thank you so much. And there's going to be a book signing. Please support. You can support our writers buying their books. There's going to be a book signing right here. If you line up to get your book signed, Nikole and Michael will be available to sign your book. Thank you.
I don't have to say anything now because that's what I was going to say.